Today, we're going to take a field trip at the David Fortier Park, a place where many of you have been before. But I'd like to start off with a quote that's very appropriate for what we're doing. This is from Marcel Proust. The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new lands, but seeing with new eyes. So although this is a place where you've probably walked around many times, with the knowledge that you have about geology, you're going to see it in a totally different way. Right where this location is, where I'm standing, we're at about 750 feet above sea level. This puts us at an elevation where a layer of rock known as Berea sandstone would be exposed. So as you recall, a generalized geological column of the rocks here for where we're at in the Cleveland area, we're at a place right about here, and we're going to be seeing some rocks from the Bedford Formation as well. Now, the rocks here formed approximately 350 to 400 million years ago. So visualize, we're in a time period at the end of the Devonian, the beginning of the Mississippian. We're going to travel down the path now. Olmsted Falls has a lot of amazing history. We're focusing specifically on this layer of Berea sandstone. And you can see the remnants of an old quarry that used to be here. Berea sandstone was described by one of Ohio's prominent geologists back in 1838. This is a picture of Charles Whittlesey. Charles Whittlesey was part of the first Ohio Geological Survey, and he described Berea sandstone, though he did not name it back in 1838. The person who actually gave Berea sandstone its name is John Strong Newberry, and he named it, I believe, sometime around 1870. These two were very good friends. They did a lot to contribute to our understanding of geology in Ohio, but they had a falling out, and that is a very interesting story. There's an excellent publication called Olmsted 200 written by Jim Wallace. And I wanted to take a moment to read a portion of this publication. Specifically, this is from January 1st, 2020. And it says, of course, Berea sandstone gets its name because it was first quarried in Berea as early as 1833 by John Baldwin, a native of Connecticut who came to Ohio in 1828 to farm 200 acres he had purchased. About 5 years after he arrived in Berea, he discovered sandstone on his property, and it had the quality to make good grindstones for sharpening tools. He initially used a mallet and chisels in the cellar of his home to craft grindstones out of sheets of sandstone. But he then took them in an ox cart to Cleveland, where he sold them. Eventually, Baldwin leased his land for quarrying, which made him a rich man. He used much of his wealth to improve the community, including the founding of Baldwin Institute, which became Baldwin University, then Baldwin Wallace College, and finally Baldwin Wallace University. Quarrying on Baldwin's land was just the beginning of quarrying that spread throughout Berea, changing the contours of the community and then to other communities that had the same type of sandstone. And that leads us to where we are standing in the park. Sometime just around 1870, a man by the name of Luther Barnum was operating this area as a Berea sandstone quarry. I don't think the quarry was in operation for terribly long, but when I stop here and I look at the pile of sandstone that's here, I think about the back-breaking labor that went into busting out these large chunks of rocks, and then I wondered to myself, why was it just all left there? After they went through all the trouble of breaking it up, what happened? What happened that day? It was just one day they said, okay, there's no more work, we're not selling it, everybody just pack up your tools and go home. I don't know, I'm sure there's an interesting story behind that. I want to call your attention to features that look like half pipes that are carved into some of the rocks. You can see it in the upper right rock there. You might be familiar with the fact that besides hand chiseling down into the rock, they also used powder for blasting. And so oftentimes they would drill down and they would drop their explosives into the holes that they had made, and that would help to fracture the rocks. We're going to move on to a site further down the path. The people who owned the quarry needed a method of transporting the rock that they were quarrying out, and so they had a system of railroads that would transport their merchandise. And if I'm not mistaken, I think this piece of metal that you see sticking out of the ground here was part of that railroad system that they used for moving the Berea sandstone. This beautiful wall that you see here was built by a former student of mine as his Eagle Scout project. And I just want to give a shout out to all of the Eagle Scouts. The work that you do really does improve the community. Now, I'd like to call your attention to the Berea sandstone that we see across Plum Creek. So we'll get up close to Plum Creek and look over. We're now looking across Plum Creek, and I want to call your attention to the far side, a site that you have probably seen many times before. Right underneath the trees, you see a layer of exposed Berea sandstone, and then beneath it, we see the Bedford Formation, specifically Bedford Shale. As I had mentioned previously, these layers of rock were forming at the end of the Devonian, beginning of the Mississippian, sometime around 350 to 400 million years ago. At that point in time, what we call Ohio today was located just a little bit south of Earth's equator. The land that is now Ohio was under a warm, shallow ocean. And at this point in time, due to the action of plate tectonics, the continental land masses were moving and starting to collide. At about this point in time, North America was colliding with Africa, starting a series of events which eventually built up the Appalachian Mountains. It took many different mountain building events to create the entire Appalachian chain, but when it was completely done, it was tall, like the modern day Himalayas. The mass of those mountains pushed down the land which is now on the eastern side of Ohio. And that allowed for this warm, shallow ocean to occupy the land there. Sediments from those eroding mountains of the early Appalachians were transported from what is modern day Canada now down to the south and to the west and deposited here where we're standing. When you think about the size of sediment that makes up shale, that's a very small sediment size. The size of sediments that make up sandstone are larger, sand-sized grains. So what we see is the size of the sediments getting bigger as we go from the bottom layers of rock to the top. What this means is that over time, the depth of the water that was here at our location started to shallow up. Now, I'm being very superficial about the formation of Berea sandstone. There's a lot to learn about it, but I want to call your attention to the Berea sandstone that we see right here at Plum Creek. When you look across, you will notice that you see diagonal layers of sand-sized sediments, as opposed to completely horizontal layers of sediment in the sand. What you're looking at here is something called cross-bedding. This would indicate that we had rapidly moving water that was depositing these sand-sized grains. And more than that, we can figure out infer the direction that the water was flowing. When I take a look at this, I see that the slip face, the horizontal side, is going at an angle like this. Recalling that particles get transported up and then go down the slip face, if I contemplate, okay, I want to infer which direction was the water flowing here, well, I can infer that the water was most likely flowing from my right to the left, because the particles would have come up from the side and then gone down the slip face on the opposite side. What was going on at the time that the Berea sandstone was forming? I had mentioned to you that the Appalachian Mountains were starting to wear down. Those sediments from that mountain range were carried by rivers down towards what is modern-day Ohio. When those larger sand-sized sediments hit the water that was here, the sediments slowed down, dropped out of suspension, and formed a delta. As you can see on this map right here, the sand that forms Berea sandstone was part of an ancient river delta. There are some parts where the Berea sandstone is deep, cut into channels of the ancient riverbed that filled up, and anywhere that you find the Berea sandstone with its really uniform grain size and uniform color, that's the best of the Berea sandstone that gets quarried. And in fact, there are still Berea sandstone quarries in operation today out west of here. But getting back to what we were saying with the Berea sandstone in this spot right here in Fortier Park, we can see that this was not a deep river channel. The fact that there's cross-bedding here would indicate we had some rapid water flow, and that's what was causing the cross-bedding that you see. In addition to this, I wanted to point out that you seldom find lots of fossils in Berea sandstone. The sediments were just moving too quickly for good fossilization situations, but that doesn't mean you don't find some fossils in Berea sandstone. If you can visualize where the Berea sledding hill is, there is an outcrop of Berea sandstone there that's got a log embedded in it, and it looks a lot like driftwood. That fossilized log is rounded, and you can visualize the action of the water probably tumbled that log and wore off its edges like a modern day piece of driftwood, and there it is, fossilized over by the sledding hill if you take the time to go look for it. I want to pause here, right underneath the covered bridge, and point out a couple of things. If you didn't notice, the base of the covered bridge is constructed out of Berea sandstone. And when you look closely at it, you can see some of the markings that were involved with the quarrying of the stone. But next I want to call your attention to the space where the layer of Berea sandstone, which is very durable and juts out, comes in contact with the Bedford shale, which is a lighter gray in color. If you know anything about shale, you're probably used to seeing shale being in flat sheets. You know that shale is a very weak type of rock. You can pull it apart with your hands, and it comes apart like pages of a book. But this shale looks completely different. It's not in nice flat horizontal layers. It seems to be all twisted up. Let's stop and think for a moment. Why would that shale not be in nice horizontal layers? Why does it look like it's all rolled up? Well, shale, as you know, formed from smaller size particles, probably dropped out in a little bit deeper water, maybe calmer water situations. But when this more durable Berea sandstone was forming, maybe there was such a tremendous load of sand that got deposited on top of the Bedford shale that the Bedford shale began to deform. One way you can think about it is if a kid came along to a mud puddle and jumped into the mud puddle and you see everything go splashing. So think about all of these sand-sized sediments being transported, dumping down onto this weaker shale, deforming the shale, and causing these roll shapes that you see in it, right where the Berea comes into contact with the Bedford. Homestead Falls, of course, gets its name because of all the beautiful waterfalls that it has. These waterfalls are formed because the durable Berea sandstone resists weathering and erosion, but the weaker shale beneath it does not. When that weaker shale gets worn away, ledges of sandstone stick out and the water cascades over them, forming the falls. This part of the park really fascinates me. When I look here, it appears as if there's a pile of grindstones that somebody got started. They're not finished grindstones. But I wonder to myself, what happened? They got going on these circular discs of Berea sandstone. They neatly stacked them all up and then just walked away. What happened? Why did they just leave them here? And to me, they're very, very beautiful. They're like a work of art on their own. They kind of remind me of dragon scales. This part of the park has a few grindstones, rough cut in some cases, that are composed out of Berea sandstone. And I wanted to point out to you that from where we're standing right here, you can observe where Plum Creek and the West Branch of the Rocky River come together. And there it is, the spot where Plum Creek and the West Branch of the Rocky River join. This rock that we see over here, which is rounded and smooth, and it's granite, is definitely something different from the types of rock that we see around here. It's, clearly an igneous rock. It is not a sedimentary rock. So how did this rock get here? Many of you probably already have guessed that rock is a glacial erratic. Once again, part of Ohio's rich geologic history, this piece of granite was plucked by glacial ice from the Canadian Shield and pushed all the way down here where you see it today. And in the process of pushing this chunk of granite, it's polished and rounded it off. So you're looking at a Canadian immigrant resting right here in Fortier Park. Maybe you've noticed the sign quarry and you've wondered to yourself, quarry? Do I see a quarry? We're pretty lucky because this park is a remnant of a quarry that you don't need to put on scuba diving gear to explore. I am presuming that this is still part of Luther Barnum's old quarry from sometime around 1870. And as we walk this way, very carefully so that you don't trip on the uneven stone, you can see the flat walls of where the quarrying was occurring. Now, if you were to go over to Coe Lake or Jaquay Lake, those are indeed old quarries which are near this location, but those quarries have filled up with water. You can't easily see what the remnants of the quarries look like. They just look like lakes or ponds. But here you can walk into an old quarry that's a wonderful place to explore. This location does an excellent job of showing the more durable Berea sandstone jutting out over top of where the less durable Bedford shale is. When I look down, I can see chunks of Bedford shale that have dropped away. leaving this overhang of Berea sandstone. I got down in here. I'm living on the wild side. Here we go. Wanted to get down so we could see exactly where the Berea sandstone comes in contact with the Bedford Shale. And this is a perfect location for it. Here's some really big chunks of shale that you can see. They've broken off. Actually, now that you think about it, it's kind of a dangerous spot because any of these rocks could break off at any point in time. But look here. Look at how this layer of rock is light grayish in color. It's easy for me to run my fingers through it, break it into little pieces. I can see the layers just breaking apart right here. And then moving up, and I see the more solid sandstone. I'm just having far too much fun. So right here, this is it, showing the place where the Bedford Shale comes in contact with the Berea sandstone. I've gotten right up close to where the crossbedding is now. You can see it here. Check out these rather diagonal layers of sediment. And then if I go a little bit further along the path, man, right here is where you see where the sandstone is coming into contact with the shale. And I'm right up close to a spot where the shale is all roiled up and deformed. Up there is where we were standing earlier. I have come across Plum Creek, and I am now standing right where the Berea sandstone is overhanging the Bedford Shale. And this gnarled section of lighter gray rock, that's Bedford Shale, I believe, all twisted up, possibly due to the force of the sediments that formed the Berea sandstone pressing down on it and deforming it. You can truly see why this is called Olmsted Falls. Well, this brings us to the end of our field trip, and I hope I have helped you see our park with fresh eyes. Now, I've just scratched the surface of the history of this location. There's so much more that you can learn. Maybe you want to fact check something that I've said or explore more on your own. There are many great resources that you could use to do that, and have fun with it. We have got fascinating geology in Ohio and fascinating geology right here in Olmsted Falls.